Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Miras. Today I'm talking to the poet Samuel Hazo about Jacques Maritain's philosophy of art. Great guest for you today, one of my favorites so far on the show. And before I say anything in particular about him, I just have to say it has been really rewarding for me on this show when I've gotten to interview older people. My very first episode was an interview with Chicago actor Tony Makis Sr., and I think he was 87 at the time that we recorded that episode, somewhere around there. I've talked a couple times to Father Basil Cole. I'm not sure exactly how old he is. He's certainly very energetic, but he's an older man. Today's guest is, I believe, 91 years old. Now, of course, age brings with it experience, and with experience has the potential to come wisdom, which all of these men I've talked to possess. But the thing I've noticed with the men of this age that I've talked to is they just have so much heart and so much love and enthusiasm for the things that they're talking about. And maybe it's just not a matter of age. It might also be a generational thing where people my age are more repressed in showing really heartfelt, unironic enthusiasm. And of course, we all know that not all of our elders have this, but I do think it is something that takes on an especial beauty and depth of soul with someone who's aged well. All that is to say that it's been a privilege to interview these men, and in particular, today's guest, Dr. Samuel Hazo. Here are some of Dr. Hazo's accomplishments in no particular order. He was the first poet laureate of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania from 1993 to 2003. He is the McAnulty Distinguished Professor of English Emeritus at Duquesne University, where he taught for 43 years. He is the founder and director of the International Poetry Forum in Pittsburgh, and he is the author of many books, fiction, essays, plays, novels, and I think about 30 collections of poetry, some of which you will hear him recite in this interview. Also, I should say he has translated numerous works into English from other languages, including French and Arabic. So, as to the topic of today's episode, we are talking about the contribution of the French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain, who I've mentioned many times on this show, specifically on the subject of poetry. The occasion for this conversation is the publication of Dr. Hazo's book, The World Within the Word, Maritain and the Poet. This was his doctoral dissertation written about 60 years ago, which was only published last year by Franciscan University Press. As you'll hear in the interview, Dr. Hazo actually met Maritain and corresponded with him, and Maritain wrote the preface to the book. So as a work of secondary literature on Maritain, it has the blessing of the primary subject. My goal in this episode was to do a complete overview of Maritain's contribution to the philosophy of art. We didn't quite get there, but we give you a substantial taste of his contribution. Now, another thing I loved about this interview was that often when you're talking to someone about a new book that they've just published, the interview doesn't contain that many surprises. In other words, you're basically covering a lot of the same ground that has covered in the author's book that you just read. But not only is Dr. Hazo the sort of person who probably doesn't like to repeat himself in a boring way, but this book was written 60 years ago, so he's had 6 decades of experience and further reflection on these matters, which really adds a lot to the interview. So even though we're discussing Maritain's thought, Dr. Hazo will often summon up the perfect anecdote or recite a poem, whether one of his own or by somebody else, seemingly from memory, which illuminates the point being discussed. So that makes the interview a real treat to hear as well. And for that reason, actually, I'm not going to be doing a reading like I normally do at the end of each interview because you'll have already heard so much great poetry recitation by Dr. Hazo. So here is the man. Dr. Hazo, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thank you very, very much.
I guess we could perhaps start with your personal encounter with Maritain, or actually, how did you first become familiar with who he was and his writings on art?
Well, I went to the University of Notre Dame in the mid and late 40s, and Maritain was required reading in not just in courses in philosophy, but in literature.
Wow.
Well, that was just the way it was. They had, several internationally known professors there, Frank O'Malley, a number of others. And he introduced me to Maritain, and to my complete satisfaction, I found that Maritain answered many questions about creativity and about what art was supposed to be. So later on, I was in the service, and then I returned and worked on a doctorate at the University of Pittsburgh and asked the very tolerant people at the university if I could do a doctoral dissertation on the aesthetic of Jacques Maritain. And it was, I was in the English department, and I was getting a PhD in English. And to their credit, they said fine. It came under the bracket of literary theory.
Yeah, now Maritain was better known at that time in general, not just in the Catholic world, wasn't he?
That's right. Yeah, he was known politically because of many of his contributions that had to do with the establishment of the United Nations after the war, and he was a man that was consulted for his political and his humane convictions. But he also had a long-standing interest in creativity. So after the university approved the thesis, I began writing it and researching it, and then I found out that Maritain and his wife were at that time at Princeton University as a resident. And I called and asked him if I could see him. And he welcomed that, and I went, and we had a conversation about the thesis and about the dissertation, and he said he liked some of my views, so he said, if you ever, publish this book, I'd be happy to write an introduction to it. And I thanked him, and he indeed wrote an introduction. So, and we had some correspondence. So subsequently, I put the book on hold. I never thought of publishing a dissertation. I figured publishers weren't interested in that. So I kept the dissertation and his introduction for over 50 years. Mm-hmm. And a friend of mine happened to see it. And he said, this should be published. So he contacted some people he knew at the Franciscan University Press. They were very interested. And they published it with the introduction. It's the only, from what I was told, it's the only introduction of a book that Maritain ever wrote.
Wow.
So it's quite an honor.
Yeah, truly.
Quite a surprise, really. Look, they did a beautiful job on the book, and I'm delighted that it's out.
It's a great book. I just have to ask before we start discussing the book, what was it like, visiting with Maritain and his wife?
Well, they couldn't have been. His wife wasn't well. I never met Raisa Maritain, but she was upstairs, and she couldn't come down. But I thought he was just as good as I imagined him to be. He was very, very genteel, very gentlemanly. He was exact, kind. He had all the qualities that a artist philosopher should have.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I've been reading his philosophy of art for several years now, and certainly one of my heroes, one of my favorite writers.
He's deservedly so.
So this work was written, 60 years ago now?
1957.
Okay, and in it, you basically summarize Maritain's contribution to the philosophy of art. The subtitle is Maritain and the Poet, but when you say the poet, you're not just talking about the type of poet who writes verse, correct?
Well, it's not confined to that, but there's a great emphasis on it. But it's not confined to that, no. But his basic concept of art is very, 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 I found very close to that of Coleridge, and I said so in the dissertation. But Maritain believed in what he called poetic knowledge. I think the best way to explain that is to say there is what we call knowledge. 3 times 3 is 9. H2O is the formula for water. I could go on. This is simply flat knowledge. And then there is what Maritain calls poetic knowledge. This is when something is observed or seen in nature or even in print that inspires more than mere inspiration. For example, take the word silence. You define silence as an absence of sound. Then you read Dylan Thomas, and he said, silence is a needle passing through water. Well, the effect of that on the person looking for a definition of silence is totally different. You know, the factual definition is okay. I mean, we can live with it. But the poetic, if I could use the word definition, is much more appealing to the imagination. And that kind of poetic knowledge for Maritain was the basis of primarily of poetry, but you could say of all art. And when actuated by what he called the creative intuition, when that kind of knowledge was transformed into an inspiration to create something, then you had art or poetry.
So, yeah, let's start with maybe his definition of art. So how does Maritain conceptualize art? I know it's along the grounds of the definition of Aquinas, but I know there's a number of subdivisions and sort of types of art that he talks about. So what is art, and where does it fall in as far as the categories of the activities and virtues of man?
Well, I think essentially what he means by art is a thing that is made that has as its object the beauty and the good of the thing made. And according to Maritain, that is a creative act in the sense that it continues the work of God's work of creation. It's an ongoing cooperative act. And that's sufficient. I mean, that's almost applicable to language, to the plastic arts, to the fine arts. But it's a thing made. It has its actuation not in wisdom or in action or things of that kind, but in something that is made, created by man.
So it's the thing that it can be used to describe the object that is made, and also the virtue which tends towards the creation of that object, right?
That's right.
So within the arts, he talks about the useful and the fine arts, and the useful arts would be what we would call the arts of the artisan or the craftsman, things that exist primarily for their practical use, whereas, and they may be intended to be beautiful, but they're intended primarily for practical use. Then the fine arts are, that's a pretty commonly understood concept. Basically, defines those as the arts which have beauty, the beauty of the object made as their end.
Perfectly said.
Thanks. So within that comes, I think, the question of imitation, because there is this long-standing theory in the Western tradition of art as imitation. And Maritain does not reject this, but he adopts it in a specific sense. So in what sense does the fine artist imitate things in his art?
Well, I think Maritain simply states that if you look at the created world and you ascribe it eventually to a creator, what the artist does is imitate the creative act of God in what he makes. It comes down to that simple act. The thing that impresses me most about Maritain's theory is that it's not essentially, in fact, it's not even except tangentially related to the will. When an artist creates something, there's something that comes to him. We call it inspiration. Maritain calls it creative intuition. It has different names. It's something that comes to him that actuates his imagination, which in turn actuates his art, whatever it happens to be. And he creates something for its own sake and for the beauty that it purportedly achieves. And that's it. There's nothing more to say about it. But it's a reflection. It's essentially a reflection of the creativity of God that somehow man is able to participate in and reflect.
In what sense does the artist make something new? because he obviously can't create out of nothing, and he is dependent for maybe the storehouse of his imagination is dependent on things that he sees that have already been made in the world, or maybe to some degree in the invisible world, but typically in the sensible world. So in what sense is the artist really able to make something new in a significant sense?
Well, when you say new, I would rather say something that is seen in a new way. And this is not just confined to practicing artists. I mean, children, for example, years ago, there was a little boy playing with a ball on the front porch, and he was bouncing it up and down, and he said to me, "Look, I'm making the ball happy." The poetic statement.
Right.
You follow me?
Yeah.
And I think it applies to things that happen constantly. My granddaughter said to me about a month ago, she's just a child, she said, "Papa, today's Monday, but sometime it's Thursday." Take that for what it's worth, but it's profound.
Right.
So I think that as far as Maritain is concerned, I think that the creative intuition can operate in any person, and when you find it in poets or in artists, fine artists, it's there in a consummate way, but it can happen, as I said, in the lives of children and the lives of people. There's a wonderful story by William Faulkner, when two boys who were dirt poor in Mississippi. One of them is called to the army, and he tells his brother to take care of his plot till he comes back. Well, he goes to Memphis to enlist, and the little boy takes all of his savings. He leaves that very night to go to Memphis, and he hitchhikes, and he finally gets to Memphis, believe it or not. And he asks where the army is at, and a policeman directs him to a service station there, and he goes in. He said, "Yeah, my brother Pete, I want to see him." He said, "Get out of here, kid." So a major comes out and says, "What's the problem here?" He said, "You're my brother, and I want to see him." So they said, "Do we have his brother? What's his name?" Tell them. They bring the man. He's almost on his way to Fort Dix. They bring him back to the recruiting station. He sees his brother, whom he had seen in Mississippi just 24 hours before. And he said, "What are you doing here? I thought I told you to stay and watch my plot." And the boy says, very simply, "I couldn't do it. It hurt my heart." I mean, the poetry in that statement is amazing.
Right.
But you feel it. That's my whole point in mentioning it.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I'm a musician, and Maritain certainly wrote about music to a certain degree, but he only really wrote one essay that focused extensively on music. Mostly in his examples of artistic production, he talked about painters and poets, I think, more than anybody else. I think it's just interesting to think about this idea of seeing things in a new way, and the emphasis that Maritain puts on drawing things from nature, because whereas, Gilson focuses more on the creation of something of a totally new form, the addition of something to reality. I mean, not totally new in the sense of ex nihilo, but as a musician, it's a little more challenging to see where am I drawing from nature, except in the sense that music is based on the laws of nature, but it's in less of a sort of explicitly imitative way than poets and painters usually work. So it's sort of thought-provoking for me to kind of consider, what is it that I may be drawing from what God has created, and not necessarily just in terms of sound, but in terms of just the inner dynamic of things, like tension and release is a fundamental aspect of music, but that's kind of an abstract concept.
Well, it may not be. I'll tell him my son is a composer, so I'm going to tell him what you just said. But what is the essay of Maritain that deals with music? Which one?
It's in the collection Art and Poetry. It's called The Freedom of Song. I just read it for the first time several weeks ago.
Okay, I'll look for it. I have the book, so I probably read it, but it's been years.
Yeah, that collection, it's got his essays on three painters, and it's got a little thing called Dialogues where he debates with people like Andre Gide, if that's how you pronounce his name, and Oscar Wilde, and that sort of...
Yes, it's Gide.
Gide, okay. Yeah, so that's the one. I had read most of his writings on art except for those two essay collections, that and The Situation of Poetry, which you reference a fair amount in the book. And so I finally got around to reading those recently, and they're certainly well worth reading. I know you've read them at some point, but
I only hope that the publication of this book renews interest in Maritain, because he has kind of faded from the scene for reasons that are not quite clear to me, because I haven't seen anybody who in any way comes close to him.
Right. Certainly not on the topic of art. I mean, I would agree with that. I think the Western philosophical tradition sometimes does a disservice to artists, but even though you find the seeds of great ideas about art in Plato and Aristotle, sometimes artists don't come out too well, in the fight. So I think Maritain, I'm not sure there's anybody else in the Western tradition who comes close to Maritain in terms of philosophizing about art.
I think Coleridge, and when I mentioned this to Maritain, he got very, very interested, because Coleridge has a concept that is very close to Maritain's. Maritain believed in poetic knowledge and in the ability of creative intuition to translate creative knowledge or poetic knowledge into art. Coleridge spoke of what he called the primary imagination and then the secondary imagination. The primary imagination was the world as given, and the secondary imagination is, according to Coleridge, is what works on the world as given and translates it into something that is artistic. He calls it an esemplastic power. Well, that's as close to creative intuition as you can come. And Maritain he wrote a special letter to me thanking me just for calling that to his attention.
Okay, so continuing with our overview of Maritain's philosophy of art. So now we talked about the fine arts as those which aim at beauty as their end, their primary, if not their sole end. And that raises the question of what is beauty? So how does Maritain define beauty?
Well, he doesn't go much farther than Aquinas, id quod visum placet, that which when seen pleases. But he takes it, he gives it a spiritual dimension as well. And I mean, beauty to Maritain is something that is a transcendental. If you touch on beauty, you touch on something of the quality of God. And he doesn't depart from that, whether you're talking about the fine arts or anything else. So that to me is sufficient.
Yeah, the tricky thing with that which being seen pleases is you have to know what it means, what the word seen means, and what the word pleases means. So like in the word seen, first of all, he's not just talking about literally the sense of sight.
He should not be. It can't be confined to that.
Right. And so first of all, it can mean any of the senses, but also it doesn't stop with the senses. So he talks about this idea of the intellectualized sense, meaning that the senses are somehow permeated by the intellect, and our sensible experience of objects is permeated by intellection in an intuitive way, so that it remains in sense, and yet it goes deeper into the soul than just that. And of course, human beings are not capable of really, for the most part, I would say, or maybe not at all, capable of leaving things just at the level of sense. Even if we don't want to, it does reach the soul. So but this would be in a more sort of intentional, contemplative way. And likewise with the pleasure, it's not simply a sense pleasure. It is going further into the human person than that.
Well, he calls it an intelligentiated sense, and that's a very good phrase, even though he created it himself. But
yeah,
when you said it's something that, how did you put it a minute ago? You said it's not confined to sense. It's
right.
I was reading just a may not be related to this at all, but it had to do with I forgot who was the author, but he was talking about the death of a soldier, a French soldier in Algiers. And the president at that time, I think it was Francois Mitterrand, was presenting his mother with a medal. And when he did, he presented the medal and the flag to the mother and said he died for France, pour la France. And the mother looked at him and she said, I've lost a son. I mean, which one carries the spiritual loss deeper than that? It's different, two different ways of saying the same thing, but one is much closer to reality than the other.
Right. Yeah. So Maritain and you both raised the question of what qualifies something to be called beautiful. And as you mentioned, you've already given the answer, because Maritain sees beauty as a transcendental, which means that anything that exists participates in that.
He uses words like proportion, things that you use artistically. I mean, a work of art can impress without offending. It can stir you without arousing you. I mean, there are qualifications here, but no, I'm quite satisfied with Maritain's description of the effect of art.
Yeah, I agree. So, is the experience of beauty or our knowledge of beauty a relative, subjective thing?
Do I think it is? I think, sure, a lot of it is, absolutely.
So I guess the question is, Maritain, and I assume you would agree, say that beauty is something that exists really in things. But at the same time, it seems that our experience of it is dictated largely by our own limitations, or at least our own unique subjectivity, to put it in a more positive way.
I would agree with that, but I mean, you say you're a composer. You know immediately the difference between melodic composition and cacophony.
Right, yeah.
And I think the same thing applies in all the arts. To take, I forget who it was, to take a bucket of paint and just throw it on a canvas that was mounted. You just fling it.
Jackson Pollock.
Yeah, Jackson Pollock. And people were impressed with the freedom of that and so forth. I'm sorry it's lost on me, but it became a movement. People in the arts, I know that, I have many books of poems but I see books of poems that come out today that are defined essentially by gender.
Mm-hmm.
Woman with a capital W.
Right.
Or by status, or lately, essentially by race.
Right.
And once you're at that strata, you're not talking about poetry at all. You're talking about sociology.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all you have. But it's far flung, and it's taken root in many universities. You take courses in which unknown male poets, unknown women poets, and they're not really, in most cases, they're not poets at all. There are people who took up a particular cause and championed it, and it became noticed, and so they became noticed.
Right. Yeah, perhaps this was beginning at the time that you wrote this dissertation. It wasn't a problem that Maritain really had to comment on all that much. We didn't have this sort of art dominated by activism and politics and as sociology, as you put it, until perhaps the latter half of the century. But your comment on Jackson Pollock made me think of a comment by Stravinsky where he said, what I can't stand are these manic deviations between total, I forget exactly how he put it, but between total control and total chance. Meaning that in the world of music at that time, in the early to mid 20th century, you had composers who were like, for example, John Cage, who were doing things totally randomly.
Yes.
And almost taking their own self out of the picture. And then you had composers like the serialists, Schoenberg, Webern, who put together a theoretical mechanism that was so all-encompassing that it systematized everything totally. And in both cases, I think what you have is a failure of intuition. It's total intellect in the sense of like discursive reason, or no intellect. And to me, a failure of intuition is a failure to be vulnerable. And I think all artists struggle with this. But I think the reason that I've been thinking about this a lot lately, I think the reason that there is so little melody in music now, whether it's so-called classical music or pop music, is because it requires a lot of vulnerability to write a melody.
I agree with you, and I think that anybody who is a melodic composer has my interest immediately. I was reading a piece about Ravel. I mean, here he is. He's a Basque, Swiss Frenchman who writes a piece, the Bolero, that is universally loved. Well, his reaction to that was very interesting. He said, I mean, here's a piece known all over the world and identified with Ravel. He said, anybody in his first year of composition could have written it. But he wrote it. I mean, and he captured a Spanish soul in that music.
Right.
And he was not a Spaniard.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a great example, how simple it can be. And when I say these things, I'm not saying this as someone who's, I'm putting myself out there and writing, all this music. I'm someone who struggles with these things myself as a young musician. I'm more of a pianist than a composer. I have composed a little bit, but I'm just sort of starting as a composer now. But I don't want to make myself seem like I have all this experience, but this is just my sense of what's going on in music. Is there's a lack of willingness to be vulnerable, even with people who are willing to talk about beauty and admit that there's such a thing. I think people still, even though I think there's some of that coming back in some places. I'm a jazz musician, so that's never really gone away in jazz, but there's still a fear of putting yourself out there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Jazz musicians are probably the best musicians around.
Well, I appreciate that. So perhaps we could talk about intuition a little bit. And at first, I mean, not creative intuition specifically, but just the intuition in the experience of beauty. We talked about the intellectualized sense. I mentioned the word intuition earlier. I think you mentioned something that Maritain says, that we experience beauty by perception, not judgment, which I think is very important for especially maybe conservative types to not worry so much about having the correct judgment of a work, but experience it through perception instead, because Maritain defines intuition as something that's fundamentally non-conceptual. And that's extremely important for both the person who's taking the art in and the person who's making the art, because the intrusion of concepts have a place sort of orbiting art, but the intrusion into the actual process of concepts can be deadly.
Yeah. Well, it's related primarily to love, finally. I mean, there are things that people intuit because either with other people or with a particular kind of work they're doing, that they intuit it because they love it. And love permits them that kind of knowledge that other people, unloving, cannot have. I mean, even in personal relationships, I know one woman whose husband was about a half foot shorter than she was. And many women asked her, didn't it bother you to marry a shorter man, a man shorter than yourself? And she smiled. She didn't, she wasn't offended. She said, what attracted you to him? She looked at this person and said, I like the look in his eye.
That's great.
And you find that, and I think you find it in intuitions that come through love and that are almost infallible. I mean, people detect things in their own children For example, my wife, when my son was just maybe a year and a half old, they were sitting there watching Menotti's The Little Drummer Boy, I think. And my son just, started tapping. And next year, when he was 3 or 4, she bought him a drum, and then she bought him another drum, and then she bought him a set of drums. And when he went on to the university, he majored in percussion. And it was all because of her perception of the talent in this little baby that I didn't have. I mean, I loved him just as much as she did. But women have this intuition about children that is almost infallible. They know, how shall I say it? I mean, they know the people that love their own children.
Yeah. So where do the emotions come into this? We're talking about intuition. So that means it's not sort of the topic of feeling is unavoidable when it comes to intuition. And yet it's not mere emotionalism. So how does that work exactly?
Well, I don't know how it works, but I do know that if you hear a piece of music that stirs you, there is an emotional response. I mean, you appreciate it because of the feelings that it arouses in you. And the same thing applies to a poem. I was reading a poem of Hopkins the other day, and I'm trying to think of it. Here's the poem. He said, "I've desired to go where springs not fail, to fields where flies no sharp and sighted hail, and a few lilies blow. And I've asked to be where no storms come, where the green swell is in the havens dumb, and out of the swing of the sea." If that's not I can't think of a more perfect evocation of retreat. That poem. "I have desired to go where springs not fail, to fields where flies no sharp and sighted hail, and a few lilies blow. And I have asked to be where no storms come, where the green swell is in the havens dumb, and out of the swing of the sea." Beautiful.
Yeah. So it seems as though there are two types of emotions that can be involved in art. And, well, actually, maybe that's not the right way of putting it. But basically, when we talk about emotions in art, there are emotions that are evoked sort of in a secondary sense. And then there are that can be defined in terms of emotions that we feel every day. And then there is sort of the fundamental emotion of the intuition of beauty. And I really like the way, are you familiar with the jazz pianist Bill Evans?
I'm not, no.
Okay, so he was a great jazz pianist. He was active from the late 50s until his death in 1980. And he said something along the lines of, I think he might have been talking about Beethoven, but I can't remember. He basically said, there's emotions that are the kind of facile, everyday emotions. And then there is the emotion that is caused by the greatest music, which is simply the sense of being in the presence of some kind of perfection.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all these emotions. Obviously, a poem like the one you just quoted, it conveys a specific emotion that can be put into words, but there is also just the pure experience of beauty itself, which takes on particular characteristics in the particular poems, but there's also just the sense that it is beautiful.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Sometimes the artist himself, as I told you about Ravel, despite the immense popularity, beauty of that Bolero, he didn't overpraise it. And Tchaikovsky did the same thing with the 1812 overture. It wasn't one of his, if he were asked what was his best composition, he would not have mentioned that.
Right.
It's amazing.
Yeah, that is very interesting.
Monet was so disgusted, I guess maybe overdone, with the praise that was given to his paintings of water lilies, that he destroyed half of them.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He just got rid of them, that's all.
Wow. Well, there's a certain graciousness that an artist has to have, and just, be happy that his work has made an impact, even if he doesn't have the same judgment of it that, other people do.
It's amazing how that's true, though.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
I was watching a film the other day with Spencer Tracy called The Last Hurrah. You probably have seen it, but it's about a mayor of Boston who's a tough and somewhat corrupt, palsy-walsy Irish mayor. And he got an Academy Award for that. And he didn't get an Academy Award for that, but he had made a film, I think a couple of years earlier, called The Old Man and the Sea, based on Hemingway's book, in which he did get an Academy Award. And he said afterward, I was much better in The Last Hurrah than in The Old Man and the Sea.
So maybe the last thing we can talk about with beauty is the fact that it is a transcendental, which means that it is a participation in God. And that has very significant implications in Maritain's philosophy of art, but also in his philosophy of what the artist does and how the artist should see himself. And in the sense that there is a sense in which art for art's sake is correct, insofar as we talked about, art tends towards the good of the work made as its proximate end. But because beauty is a transcendental, it also can lead us to the source of all beauty, which is God. And that means that art is ultimately for God more than it's for its own sake, even though it is so by being what it is.
I question one phrase you had there where you said it's essentially for God. I think it is, but I don't think it begins that way. I think if somebody has an experience that gives him an insight into some particular subject, that he finds moving, and he writes it, then any transcendental attachment it has to God comes afterward. It's not something he intended, but
right.
He's grateful for when it happens. If you don't mind, I can quote a poem of my own.
Oh, sure. Yeah, please do. Anytime you want.
Pretty much says that. The poem is called The World We're Here to Make. And it goes like this. My body's eyes are fingertips. They let me see whatever I touch. A waxed tabletop, an apple in my palm expecting to be bitten. My wife's eyelids parting when I kissed her awake. And words remember themselves like felt thoughts or vows. Because returning to from Cairo was impossible, my student said, I see you never. But why go on? What touches us keeps living on without our willing it, because it's felt. We're much like lovers who long to touch and hold, since then they feel what touching lets them feel. Their feelings live again as poetry, paintings, or music. Detractors say creators are mere copyists, since God alone can make something out of nothing. Frankly, they miss the mystery, because both testaments reveal we're made in God's likeness. We reimagine what we feel in words, colors, or sounds. That's more than copying. It's recreating what would otherwise be lost. We're egotists enough to try. Sometimes we succeed.
That's great. That really does express it perfectly. Thank you for reading that.
More than welcome.
So, an important thing in the experience of beauty, even for sort of the spectator of a work of art or in nature or wherever you experience beauty, which is going to come up again in the experience of the poet, is that in perceiving beauty, we not only come into contact with things outside ourselves, but it actually simultaneously leads the mind into contact with itself. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I don't know exactly what that means. I do know that sometime let me give you an example. I was walking once in the country, and it was in the evening, it was still light, and I came across a well, and the well began at ground level. And I passed it, and I said, that's interesting. I said, Had I come this way when it was dark and passed exactly where I was and kept going, I would not have seen that well. Do you follow me?
Yeah.
And I wrote this poem in reaction to it. It explains pretty much what you think of how eventually the subject that you pick touches something in you that you didn't know was there.
Right.
This poem is called The Silence at the Bottom of the Well. It's been expecting me so long that I feel late. Dropped stones are what it's thirsty for, and I've come, armed. I listen to the ghosts of splashes plummet upward like the tired swallow of a heart near death. If I could dunk and hoist a bucket, I would taste what mountain brooks remember of the snow. Instead, I whisper down my name, my name, my name, and listen as it yo-yos in a rounding echo back, back, back. Below the parapet, the swirling walls dive farther down than I can dream, deeper, where night and water meet. The moon of the assassins waits for yesterday and never sleeps.
I love the moon of the assassins. That's awesome. That's really cool.
It was at the bottom of the well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So this idea, I mean, actually, I'm thinking of another Bill Evans quote. This great jazz pianist, Bill Evans, who was one of the most articulate jazz musicians, and as well as being, great just as a pianist and composer. He said something along the lines of, the function of music is to help us discover parts of ourselves that we didn't know existed. And that's exactly what you just said.
Yes, that's true. That's true. I think I've seen it in playwrights. I've seen it in poems, in poets. They surprise an identity they did not know was there.
So you talked about poetic knowledge a little bit already, but why don't we move on to that, since that's sort of the order that follows after talking about art in the pure sort of sense of the virtue of art, and then the topic of beauty. Now we have to talk about the artistic process. So he talks about poetic knowledge and creative intuition. I tend to agree with James Matthew Wilson, who writes in the introduction to this book that for Maritain, he seems to talk about those as though they're the same thing. But regardless, in the book, you've done something which I think is very, very productive, which is to distinguish them into two distinct movements in the creative process. So what is poetic knowledge, first of all?
Well, poetic knowledge, I try to give you some examples, is when it's more than mere factual knowledge. It's knowledge that is intuited. I'm trying to think of examples. I think poetic knowledge, I practically equate it with intuition. It's something that comes to you that you know is irrefutably true, but you can't prove it.
Right.
And it's not subject to rational proof or anything like that, but it's irrefutable. You can't act as if it didn't happen. That's why I relate a lot of these things to love, because love gives you an intuition into a place, into a person, into an action that nothing else can give you. I wrote a poem once. In fact, it's a tribute to my wife, and in it there's a reference to the fact that she always asked me to dot my I's. Because when I wrote, I often didn't. Right. So one woman came up to me and she said, "I like the poem." And I said, "What'd you like about it?" She asked you to dot your I's. A woman she'll spot a little thing like that, that I took for granted. But to her, that showed that somebody was really observant. Wouldn't let you get away with it.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example.
I had an aunt like that. She dealt in clothing, and the one time I had put on a suit, and I came in and said, "Well, how do you think this looks?" She looked at me. She says, "Blue is not your color, Sam. flat out.
Wow. Maritain uses this Thomistic word, connaturality.
Oh, yes.
To describe intuition and creative knowledge. And I'm glad that you said love there, because that's essentially what it is.
Absolutely.
So in connaturality, knowledge through connaturality means, in a technical sense, it sort of means that, I think, as I understand it, that the mind forms itself to the object that's being contemplated.
That's right, yes.
Which is also another word for definition of truth, the mind's conformity to reality, although that is usually understood in a more rational sense. But what happens with knowledge through connaturality is that the mind goes out to the object, but it also takes the object in and forms itself in a sort of union or likeness, or I think maybe another Thomistic word would be proportion to the object. And I only know this, I haven't read a lot of Aquinas, but I'm mostly getting him via Maritain. But so that is basically the idea of how the mind operates in this kind of knowledge.
It's not something that is willed. It just happened. I was thinking as you were talking of it's not even a story. I think it was a magazine article. He writes about the time he was in Africa and he was hunting or tracking a wounded lion. And he knew exactly where the lion was. And he came and he waited there for the lion to attack him. And he began suddenly to see the world from the lion's point of view. That's something you can't will to do. He was a hunter, and he knew how lions acted. And right. He tried to, if I were the lion and I knew that this man was coming after me, I would wait and wait, for the right moment. And by the time he finished, you were in the presence of that lion, in the person of that lion. That's connatural.
Wow. That reminds me of this science fiction novel called Ender's Game that's very popular since the 70s. And the concept, part of the concept there is that in order to defeat your enemy, you must love them.
Well, there's a lot to that.
Yeah. So there's a number of ways that knowledge by connaturality functions in human beings. It is how Maritain talks about elsewhere, that this is how mystical knowledge works as well, but they have different objects. But anyway, the difference between poetic knowledge and what you would call knowledge in the normal sense of the word, rational knowledge, is that poetic knowledge tends not towards producing concepts. Maritain talks about the mental word, but towards producing objects, external objects to the mind.
Well, I think that's true, but it is preceded by, and you said it earlier in our conversation, by some kind of intuitive or emotional reaction in the person. I mean, you don't just will yourself to a desk and say, I'm going to write about this that I just imagined. It's
right.
You feel. I mean, you're driven to the pencil, to the pen, or even to just thinking about it. I mean, often when I get a concept of an impulse to write something, I wait, just to make sure this is not just a fly-by-night. If it's still there after a couple of hours and it still has the same effect on me, then I let it have its way with me. But it's a very mysterious process, how words come about, how poems come about. It's really rare. It's hard to describe.
So that seed, that fundamental experience has to be there, but as you just demonstrated, it doesn't have to happen immediately. That seed can be sown, and it could be even more than a couple hours. It could even be years before it actually bears fruit in a work, or it might never, but it is in its nature to tend towards doing so.
I have a book that's coming out, I think, in March, and the title of it is When Not Yet Is Now, and it's based on a very short poem. It goes like this. A week of April Fahrenheit in late February or March is all a crocus needs to sprout and bud. The last defiance it can mount against the likely frost is brazenly to blossom. Waiting to bloom until it's safe to bloom is not for crocuses. They have the courageous impatience to bloom, though many call it folly, whenever they're ready. If they live as crocuses. If not, they die as crocuses.
I love that. And I actually read that yesterday in the catalog sent out by Catholic University Press, actually, as I didn't realize you had a new book of poems coming out until I saw that in the catalog.
Yeah, it's profoundly true to me. I just love things that have the courageous impatience to happen when they want to. I think that's what makes the world go around. That's how poems happen.
Yeah. And that's how artists have to be.
That's how jazz happens.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like, well, whatever happens, I'll make a living. I won't make a living. I'll live or I'll die, but I'm going to die being what I am,
Yeah, when not yet is now.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So I actually, let's see, I'm just going to read what I wrote here about Poetic Knowledge from when I was taking notes on the book, and maybe you can comment on whatever jumps out at you.
Okay.
Poetic knowledge tends not towards producing concepts, but towards producing objects. It is, and I quote Maritain here, situated at the minimum of knowledge and the maximum of germinative power. And you talked about, I forget who it was. It may have been Coleridge, but I don't remember. You talked about somebody who was saying that, or maybe it was Maritain, who was saying something like, in poetic experience, it's almost like the will is knowing and the intellect is moving. Something like that. Does that ring a bell to you?
No, but it sounds like something that I would like.
Yeah, I mean, there's that quote from Maritain I just read. It's situated at the minimum of knowledge and the maximum of germinative power. So I think it is a tricky concept because the will is the will and the intellect is the intellect. But basically, I think what that means, and I wish I could remember what part of the book that's in and who was talking about that, because I think you were quoting someone on this, is, well, let's see. So the will, I mean, it's because it's knowledge by love, it's experiential knowledge. It is more, as much to do with the will as with the intellect. But then because the intellect is conforming itself with the thing contemplated, the intellect is moving rather than knowing in a sort of detached and speculative way. I guess that's the idea.
I think that's true. But don't forget to mention love. Love is the, how shall I put it? Love is what makes any experience like that unforgettable.
Right. So I'll continue reading what I wrote, the note I took here. It is not some prior knowledge from which the artist draws a work of art, but it is in itself the beginning of a movement toward that work. For that reason, it is not fully realized except in the creation of a work, even though it may exist without that work ever being made. A work of fine art is one which is faithful to the original experience of poetic knowledge. And this is important and something I got from your book, which I hadn't quite understood from Maritain before. It is faithful to poetic knowledge as germinative, not an exact reproduction of the original poetic experience unchanged. So it transforms even that original experience in the creation of the work, or modifies it in some way, in part through the craft of art, but also, and perhaps primarily, through the subjectivity of the artist. In other words, the artist puts something of himself into the work. On the other hand, that is true even of the original experience of poetic knowledge, because of the union of love between the person and the thing contemplated. The thing is already being made one with himself, which means that it is changed, it is transformed into something existing in his mind, and not just an exact copy in his mind of the object as he sees it. He's seeing things in it that are, there may be a change in emphasis, or there are different things of it that come out that aren't seen on the surface, that come out in the union with himself. I'm just kind of throwing things out there now, but does that sound fruitful?
Don't change a thing. Everything you said in the past 3 minutes is absolutely true. I only wish you'd written it down in a paragraph, because it says it all.
Okay, good. Thank you. So you talk about a number of different poets. You already mentioned Coleridge with his primary and secondary imagination. The other poets that you talk about in particular in parallel to Maritain are Keats and Hopkins. Mm-hmm. Keats has this thing called negative capability, which is his way of describing at least the necessary, if not the experience itself, the sort of the necessary getting out of the way of the rational mind in the poetic experience.
Disposition that an artist has to have for creative intuition to affect him. That's why, these people say, I'm going to sit down and write a poem at 5:30 in the morning. That's the perfect formula for misery. It's not until you can't. Let me put it this way: you write a poem because you can't get out of it. That's as frank as I can be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Even if the poetic experience occurred at some earlier point, that has to be there. You can't just sort of will it into existence.
Many years ago, I'll quote it to you. Each poem I surprise from hiding is a face I learn to draw by drawing it. Master plan? None. Strategy? None, except whatever wits I pit against myself to bring it off. Never a face imagined, nor a face in fact. My making is its own solution. It tells me how it must become, and I obey, or else. I see myself as some lost swimmer of the night who must discover where he goes by going. Uncertain, dared, and curious, I stall my dive until the surface stills its saucered ditto of the moon, then plunge. Sleep's inland waves lock over me. Ashore, the sea-level world of pistols, pork chops, mirrors, and garbage ripens into headlines, but where I plummet, horses ride on wings, water burns, and willows ripe their reasons in the wind. The pure imagination of a dream is mine to swim before the baiting light betrays me, and I rise. The shore steadies where I left it. The whole unfloatable and failing world goes by as given. I swim from maybe to the merely real and make them one with words. I wonder how I did it. I wondered how I'll do it. And I've done it. That's it.
Yeah, that perfectly encapsulates how things are transformed. The world of pork chops is transformed in the poetic imagination. So you've got Keats's negative capability, which I think is basically just the discursive reason getting out of the way, to put it crudely. And then you have Hopkins talking about inscape. Now, some people may be familiar with this already, but what did he mean by inscape, Gerard Manley Hopkins?
He meant the inner nature of something that you experience poetically. I don't know how to describe it. You know his poem, The Wind Hover, don't you?
No, actually, I've only read a couple of his poems.
Well, The Wind Hover is about a falcon that's flying over a piece of country. And when you finish reading the poem, you have the impression, at least I have the feeling, that Hopkins just projected himself into the very creature that he was describing, so that he became the wind hover.
Wow. I think that's good. That makes sense. It's basically just some kind of essence of a thing. I think it goes back to that intelligentiated sense, right?
That's it. Yes, that's exactly it.
Because it's not the essence of the thing. It's somehow, if it were possible for the essence of a thing to be conveyed via sense perception, and intelligentiated, as Maritain puts it, sense perception.
That's right.
It's somewhat mysterious, but I think just comes from experience. So now, what is creative intuition to you? You distinguish it from poetic knowledge in the book.
Well, poetic knowledge is something that strikes you in a certain way that you find it unforgettable. I just gave you a couple of examples earlier on, the ball being happy.
Right.
But creative intuition is what takes that and converts it, if you're inspired or creatively inspired, and converts that into art. It becomes yours. And whether you use the word imagination or intuition, it's the same thing. I'm trying to think of an example. Do you know a poem by Robert Burns called John Anderson?
No, unfortunately. I'm not all that expert in poetry, to be honest.
Let me give you an example. Robert Burns wrote this poem. It's a wife, an older wife, speaking to an older husband. Now, what's amazing about the poem to me is how Robbie Burns projected himself into that woman to speak so lovingly about an old husband that she's walking with. She calls him my Joe, and in Scottish, my Joe means my darling. The poem is very short. It goes like this. John, there's a Scottish lilt to it, so allow me.
Okay.
John Anderson, Joe John, when we were first acquaint, your locks, the raven, your bonny brow was brent. But now your brow is bald, John. Your locks are like the snow. But blessings on your frosty pow, John Anderson, my Joe. John Anderson, my Joe John, we've climbed the hills together. And many a county day, John, we've had with one another. Now we maun totter down, John, and hand in hand we'll go, and sleep together at the foot. John Anderson, my Joe. Isn't that a beautiful poem?
Yeah, it is beautiful.
And sleep together at the foot.
Yeah.
That's a poetic miracle. I mean, here's a man speaking in the person of an old woman who's in love with her husband, and Robert Burns didn't have that reputation. I mean, he was a lover.
Fascinating. Yeah. Well, I think we got enough to give people some idea of his thoughts on all this, and yours as well. And so thank you for that. I really appreciate that.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
It's a wonderful interview.
The book, as you know, is out, so they can get it if they want it. If they want to get the book of poems, they can get that too. That won't be out for another month. Yeah,
so the book on Maritain is called The World Within the Word, right. Maritain and the Poet. And the upcoming book of poems is When Not Yet Is Now.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hazo, for that conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Call me Sam, Tom.
Okay. Thank you, Sam.
You're more than welcome.
Hope to talk to you again. God bless.
Good luck. Thank you.